Welcome to SBA University, lesson number 4, how a seller's note works in a business acquisition. The SBA made some pretty dramatic changes in 2023, and one of those was to help promote seller financing, this idea that the seller can help finance a business acquisition along with the lender. Why that's important is when a seller helps to finance the transaction, it usually means that they will help stay involved post-sale. In this lesson, we will deep dive into everything you need to know about a seller's note, how it works, your options with it, and why I think it kind of benefits every party involved. So a seller note means the seller of the business agrees to finance a portion of the transaction, meaning it's essentially a debt payment that you'll have to pay to them over a period of time. Let's use an example. Let's say the business is for sale for $1 million, and let's say the seller agrees that they'll finance $100,000 of that transaction. So at the day of closing, that seller will receive $900,000, and then you will owe them $100,000, usually over a series of payments for a period of time. Now, with an SBA loan being 10 years when there's no real estate involved, banks will typically want the seller's note to match that same length. They don't like the idea of the seller getting paid back their seller note before the SBA loan gets paid back. So in that scenario, that $100,000 loan amount will be paid back over a 10-year period of time. Now, something to keep in mind with seller's notes is why they might be beneficial for you as the buyer. Now, think about that seller that has owned that business for 20 years, 30 years. They know that business inside and out. By having them finance a portion of that transaction, more than likely they'll take your call if you have any questions because you owe them money. So the worst case scenario I can think of as a new business owner is you try to get a hold of the previous one and they don't pick up your phone, they don't call you back, they're on the beach enjoying their retirement, and you're stuck with a business that you're not sure how something works. That seller note can be a key piece to keeping the previous owner engaged in the success of the business. Another really big benefit of the seller's note is it can actually help with your equity injection. Like I mentioned in a previous video, the SBA requires 10% equity injection of the total project cost. With the help of the seller's note, the equity injection you can contribute actually can go down. Now, per SBA rules, the seller can actually finance the entire 10%. Now, the difficulty with that is you're going to have a hard time finding a lender that's comfortable with you, the buyer, not putting any money into the deal yourself. Now, a common structure might be 5% seller's note, 5% equity injection. So let's take that scenario where the equity injection requirement is $100,000. So $100,000 is 10% of the total project cost. Now, without any seller financing, you would be responsible for putting in the $100,000. Now, with a seller note that's able to help you out, it could be a scenario where you put in 5%, so you put in $50,000 instead of $100,000, and the seller puts in $50,000. So in that scenario, you're only coming out of pocket $50,000. Now, something to keep in mind is the repayment terms change a little bit when the equity injection has some seller financing to it. Now, per SBA rules, one of the major changes is they'll actually allow interest-only payments starting month 1, assuming first, the lender's okay with it, and 2, there's cash flow to support that interest-only payment. But that's significant because under old rules, when that seller note used to be part of the equity injection, it would have to be on standby for the life of the loan. So think about that. An owner looking to retire, having to wait 10 years to receive any payments on that seller's note. One of my favorite transactions is that manager looking to buy the business and become the owner. You can't ask for much better, direct experience. You know the customers, you know the employees, and obviously the owner has a level of trust in you if you're going to be the one that buys the business. A lot of times, the most difficult element of buying that business is the equity injection requirement. In that scenario, you might only need to bring in, let's say, for example, 2.5%. Because of your direct experience, lenders will be okay with you bringing in less equity injection. So again, let's take that $1 million scenario where the business is for sale for $1 million. There's a scenario where you might only have to bring in 25, 30 grand equity injection if the seller is able to finance the remaining amount to get to that full 10%. And lenders are okay with that because you have the true experience to keep that business running. So from a risk standpoint, it's considered less risk than an outside buyer coming in to be the new owner, having to learn about all the customers, getting to know all the employees and how things work from day to day. So I always enjoy getting that request of the longtime manager looking to buy the business that they're working at. And usually it comes with more favorable terms regards to equity injection. So let's talk about how a seller's note, I think, kind of benefits all parties involved in the transaction. So let's start with the buyer, right? The buyer gets some help financing from the owner. I'd like to think they're going to have an engaged owner post-sale, knowing that they want to be paid back. The bank likes the transaction because, hey, it lowers our loan amount, which helps with cash flow. And the seller might like it because it actually reduces their taxable income for that year and allows them to attach an interest rate to a payment that they can receive over a number of years into the future. So that reoccurring income stream that somebody might like in their retirement. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're negotiating the seller's note with the broker or the seller is that the lender is going to have ultimate approval authority on how that seller's note is going to look and sound. So let me give you some examples, right? So the seller's note repayment terms can come in a few different ways. So let's assume that the seller's note is used to get to the 10% equity injection, then your only option is going to be interest only for 2 years. If it's not part of the equity injection, so let's say you're bringing in the 10% and the seller is maybe financing 5 or 10% on top of that, a lender can approve actually principal and interest payments starting month 1. Or if cash flow is tight, it could be interest only. There's some things about the deal that increase the risk level, or let's just say the cash flow really doesn't even support interest only payments. A lender can actually put a 2-year standby, which means the business has to operate for 2 years post-sale, and then the new owner would have to come back to the bank and request permission to start making payments on that seller's note. The seller has to be okay on that 2-year wait period. Now, the benefits of allowing interest only or principal and interest payments starting right away is that after 2 years, that seller's note actually becomes eligible to be refinanced utilizing an SBA loan. And that's really important because when you're in negotiations with the seller, they might not like the idea of having to wait 10 years for the full payment. Well, the good news is actually they might only have to wait 2. Assuming the business can support the refinance of that seller's note, there's a scenario where the seller can actually get their money in full in 2 years. Now, keep in mind, if the bank determines that they want to start out post-sale with a 2-year standby, so after 24 months of payments, the new owner can come back to the bank and request to refinance that seller's note to make that old business owner whole. So in that scenario, 2-year standby, 24 months of payments, so 4 years. Another thing to keep in mind is you can actually break seller's note into 2 different seller's note. So I've seen many times, especially on larger seller's notes where the owner wants to get payments right away. So let's say a business owner allows you a $500,000 seller's note for a $3 million transaction. The bank might not think you can afford full principal and interest payments on the full $500,000 starting month 1. So one thing that you can do to satisfy the seller is to break it into 2 $250,000 seller's notes. So the benefit of that is if we can greenlight one of those payments to start, whether it's principal and interest or interest only, is that after 24 months, you can look into refinancing that seller's note. And then at that point, the seller can get their $250,000 or whatever the remaining balance is on that note. And at the same time, you can start payments on the second seller's note. So something to keep in mind, it can be broken up into 2, and that could be the difference between a seller offering a larger seller's note and being okay with the payment structure. So now that you bought the business and you start making payments, one thing to keep in mind is the lender has ultimate authority on when those payments can start and stop. If the business is not looking like it can support both the SBA loan and a seller's note payment, the lender actually has the authority to stop those payments. And in reverse, if you're looking to refinance that seller's note, or maybe you're looking to go from interest only to principal and interest, the business cannot support the cash flow. The bank will not allow those payments to start. It's a key detail that the seller's going to want to know, and they're going to want to know up front because they don't want to be caught off guard when they ask you to go refinance that seller's note and you come back and say that you can't. Full disclosure is really important with seller's note. You want to make sure you hash that out at the beginning, not at the closing table, not 2 years after you bought the business. So it's really important to identify the rules of the seller's note, the terms, and then obviously come to an agreement that everybody will be satisfied with. So in conclusion, I firmly believe a seller's note should be a part of the conversation with every business acquisition. Knowing that the business owner is willing to take some of the risk, that they feel confident in the business that will continue to perform well after sale, is really something that I look into. While a seller's note is not required for every transaction, it's something I would ask about. It can help lower your equity injection, it can help strengthen the cash flow, and from a bank standpoint, it could be the difference between a deal getting approved and declined. Until next time, class dismissed. Thank you for watching this episode of SBA University. Hopefully you found this episode helpful. If you need to get a hold of me directly, I'll leave my email address down in the description. Be on the lookout as I will be releasing new lessons every week to help you in your SBA journey. Thanks.